It is great to see the thousands of you in the room today, millions really, of you. I think it's safe to say it is the largest ever audience for the Logan Symposium ever. I don't know if it's safe or not, but it's I know many of you. Some of you are losers, and some of you, I'm sure, are good people. We have a bigly panel for you today, so let's get right to it. I'll do my introductions, and he's back. There you go. That's called stretching, just to make sure that everybody's here. First, closest to me, Susanne Craig, investigative reporter at the New York Times. She was formerly at the Wall Street Journal, the Globe and Mail. She's been covering Trump specifically since early 2016. And in that year, she's done a ton of tremendous investigative work. And she also had his taxes show up in her mailbox. And her reporting is actually kind of a case study for young students in that all of the reporting that you do on a topic actually helps the other reporting that you do on the topic. You build sources, you're able to verify things faster because you're not coming to it cold. But one of the things that you find in some of her reporting, especially on Trump's empire, is that he does care about how he is perceived, especially when it comes to his wealth and how grand he is. So let's just start with that. I mean, you covered kind of the Trump planes for a while, something that most of us didn't pay that much attention to.
Yeah, it was a beat that I was the only one writing on it for a little while. It was interesting. I come from covering Wall Street, and I learned when I covered Wall Street that you should always look for an individual and what their hobbies or potentially their weaknesses are. And I quickly learned with Donald Trump that his hobby and his passion was his planes. And I didn't really at first think about the planes a lot, and I was talking to somebody on Wall Street about Trump just after I'd started covering him in early 2016. And this fellow I was talking to runs a very large financial firm and was talking about Trump and mused that he would never get on one of Donald Trump's planes. And I was surprised. I'd never really given them much thought. And he said, well, they're so old. And I thought, really? And I started to look into them, and it turns out that they are, while he uses them, they are, as we learned during the campaign, largely a marketing tool. He has 5 aircraft. He's got 2 planes, the big 757, a Cessna, and then 3 helicopters. And the helicopters are mainly used at his properties to fly guests around. So I started looking into the planes, was sort of doing I did quite a scrub on it. Fortunately, the FAA keeps very good records, everything from repairs to the history of the planes. And they became these great personalities. The 757 had done a tour of duty in Mexico, and they were, except for the Cessna. The Cessna is a little bit, it had been bought a little bit more recently, but they were fairly aging. And in doing the story, I had discovered that the Cessna, its registration had expired. It was $5 to renew it, but he had let it expire. Well, that may not sound like a big deal. I think we talked about insurance last night. If he ever got into trouble and there had been a crash, his insurer would care very much that registration had expired, and if there was any claims against him, he would have been in trouble. So I had worked for about a month and a half on these stories, and we had to eventually call the FAA to alert them to this, and that triggered a story before I was actually set up to do the big chat that I wanted to do with Trump and the bigger story that we were doing for the Sunday Times on the planes. When I called the FAA, within 24 hours, they moved to ground the Cessna. So that created a whole separate series of stories in the week that it was grounded. He couldn't use it for the week. For some technicality, they had to fly it to Canada and back. So I did the story, and then I put in the interview or the request for an interview with Donald Trump. And I wasn't sure if he would go for it, but they called me back and said that he very much wanted to talk to me. And we were pushing for the Saturday paper, so I needed to talk to him by 3. They actually canceled the Friday interview. But Saturday morning he calls me, and I'm really braced for an earful about this. I'd already done a number of stories. The first one he'd threatened to sue us on. Every story he'd spent hours and hours of time on the phone either with me or my editors complaining about it. He's very focused about what we write about him, and we'd been going round and round. So I wasn't sure when he called on the Saturday how it was going to go, but he called, and I could hear he was in the Sikorsky. I thought he couldn't use the Cessna that day because it had been grounded. I could hear the chopper blades above, and I thought he was going to start yelling about the Cessna. The first thing he says to me is, "It's great to talk to you this morning. I'm on my way to a rally, and I want to make America great again, just for you." And I'm thinking, okay, well, I'm not going to bring up the Cessna issue or the other stories. And he just starts talking about the planes. He just loves them. And eventually I lost the call because the plane took off. But before I lost it, he's like, "I'll call you back as soon as I'm on the ground." And sure enough, he did. And then he got to the rally, and he just keeps talking about how much he loves the 757. And then I'm bringing up the issue that we're sort of talking about, the fact that they're aging, and I got some stuff from him on that, and then he had to go again. He's like, "Okay, I'll call you back for the third time." And then on the third call, he called me back I watched the rally, and he called me back after the rally again to continue to talk about the planes and how much he loved the 757. And I'm sort of out of questions. He's a little bit irked that we're writing a story about the aging aircraft, but he's still talking about how much he loves it, and typical New York Times, you find something bad even about my aircraft. And then I started asking him about how he was billing the planes, because it's another story I wanted to do, how he was billing them to the campaign, and I had some questions about that. And then the conversation really went sideways, and he really got upset, and he says, now he knows who I am. And he said, I knew not to call you back, and he got mad about the previous stories I've written. And he said, and this is just how it's going to work. You're going to write badly, and I'm going to tweet badly, and that's the way we play the game. And it was like the ending, and then I had a whole script ready on how to handle it, in terms of I was just prepared for the thing to go sideways at the beginning. And I brought up another story I'd written that I didn't think he would have been as upset about. He hadn't read the story. I volunteered to get him a subscription to the Times at that point. And then he really backed down really quickly, which is something I found in conversations that he does. And then the call ended, and the next morning he tweeted about the story and how much he didn't like it, true to form.
And something else that's happened, I guess, in your reporting is that he has sort of his own narrative, that he pushes forward a fact in his own mind, whether it's true or not, but sometimes he repeats it as if you're just going to be convinced by repetition.
Well, I think a really effective part of Donald Trump and his ability to sell his story has been repetition, and whether or not it's true or not, he repeats over and over the idea of his success. He doesn't mention he's a businessman who's run several companies into the ground. His success has been fueled by the fact that he's had huge amount of losses built off other people's money. Those losses have been put on his tax return. They were essentially turned into a gift card from the US government, where he was able to shelter taxable income for decades longer. He's a businessman, but I would think primarily he's a marketer. I also think another thing that I see a lot is the repetition of the idea that he's a billionaire. We have no proof that he's a billionaire. So many people write and talk about it. I was watching the TV this morning, and they were talking about the billionaire businessman Donald Trump, his global empire. There's just a lot of things that get put in the repetition based on his story that get repeated over and over that I think journalists need to challenge. I'm very careful in the reporting, and when Times reporters come to me or I see things, just about saying it's not that he may be a billionaire. We don't have any proof that he is, and I think that that's an important thing. It's just sort of how you look at a lot of the things that have been repeated over and over. It doesn't make them true.
Okay. Sitting next to Susanne, Stephen Ginsberg. He's worked his way up from a copy aide at the Washington Post in 1994 now to the senior political editor there. He is the editor that's responsible for David Fahrenthold, who won the Pulitzer, so it does take a team effort to win these prizes, so congratulations on that. He's also, one of 50 people or so that you have covering politics, which is incredibly rare in the American newsroom today.
Yeah, it's about 55 now.
When you've interviewed him, you did for a previous story, or some of your reporters come back after interviews with him and you're looking over the notes or maybe the transcripts, is there a difference in the president that is seen in a one-on-one or one-on-two situation when there's not the Klieg lights and the cameras rolling versus the one that is often on our airwaves?
Yeah, I mean, you see a lot of the same traits, obviously. But in public, my view on it is that he basically tries to dominate whichever scene it is. He plays to the crowd. In public, that means being sometimes combative to the point of being militant. In private, it's very different. It's a charm offensive, and he's captivating. And a word that would be used for it that I think is fair is that he's fun. And that's what he tries to be. The first time I interviewed him was about 90 minutes at his country club in Northern Virginia. And you're sitting there waiting. The scene is the staff at the country club. This was winter time. There was no one at the country club. The staff had set 2 tables because they didn't know which window he wanted to sit by. And so they were very nervous about that. And so the setting it makes everyone very anxious. What is the boss going to do? And he comes in, and he's just a flurry of Donald Trump. And we see that in public sometimes, but it's an honor to meet you. I'm so excited you're here. Let's go. My hair, it's windy today. My hair's going crazy, and then you're like off to the races, and for 90 minutes. And he would get very caught on side issues. He got very caught incorrectly on my age. He thought I was young. And we talked about that for a long time, and he's just everywhere. And the second time I interviewed him was some months later after he had banned the Washington Post. I think people probably remember that. He made a big deal that he banned our paper from all of his events, and he never had really articulated why he did that other than that we're the fake media or whatever he had said. And so I reached out to him. I wanted to know exactly what was the problem, what was his issue with our coverage. So that time I went by myself to Trump Tower, and it's a very tense atmosphere at that point in the campaign. It was right before the conventions. There was a lot of heat coming his way. And I walk in, everybody looks at me a little funny when you go up through security and everything. You walk into his office, and he says, "Look at you, you're so young," and then you're off to the races again. And he gets on his phone, and he's like, "You got to come meet this guy from the Washington Post, big guy, come here." And then he's like, "You got to meet my daughter." He calls Ivanka, and it's like that for about 45 minutes. And then we had a very tense 10-minute discussion about Dave Farenthold. And then it happened to be the day that James Comey gave his press conference, and he invites me to watch it with him. So we all go outside, and then like the whole team is there, and we're in Trump Tower watching James Comey. He's asking me, what do I think? Is this good? Is this bad? It's bad. I think it's bad. And he's going on and on and on, and then it ends, and then you leave. And it's very different. We do get some of what you described. Some of our reporters do get yelled at quite fiercely with numerous phone calls back to back to back. But you also get a kind of different kind of Donald Trump quite often. I think he did quite a lot of interviews this week in the Oval Office, and you saw some of that come out of it. They just ran the gamut of what he was talking about and his attitude, and it's quite an experience.
I think he tries to win the call, and then if it doesn't work, it kind of goes sideways. But
Right.
He starts with that.
He's an atmospheric person. He has a very tight comfort zone. If he feels like the vibe is good, he feels like things are going to work out. We're all getting along here. And in my case, when we were there discussing the ban, we talked about that for a short period of time. He said, "What do you want to do about it?" I said, "Nothing. I think our coverage is fine." And he said, "Well, we're going to disagree on that." And that was kind of it. It was not something that he wanted to change or we wanted to change.
Next up, Tim O'Brien, executive editor of Bloomberg View and the Gadfly. Before this, he's been at the Huffington Post, the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal. He's authored several books, and one, interestingly enough, that you might have seen is called TrumpNation, The Art of Being the Donald. It's such a large picture. Okay. But you helped research a book on him even in the late 80s and covered him for another book that you wrote on gambling. So I'm assuming that you've had multiple of these instances that these first two reporters have kind of described. Has he always been this way?
He's been this way, I think, since he was about 7, and I think he continues to be this way. It's who he is. I think I first encountered Trump in the late 80s. I was the research assistant on the late Wayne Barrett's first big book on Trump, The Deals and the Downfall. Wayne died the day before the inauguration, unfortunately, though I think he got out right in time. And then I wrote a book about gambling in the mid-'90s, and I interviewed Trump for one chapter of that book. And I covered him as a reporter at the New York Times, and then wrote the book that he sued me for. He's never changed in the entire time that I've interacted with him. I think he loves attention. He's deeply insecure. He doesn't like facts. He's a pathologic liar. He's fun. He's charismatic. He lacks emotional, intellectual, and strategic discipline. He's not a great business person. We have examples of great business people in this country. Herb Sandler is sitting right here. Herb built a business from scratch. He ran it well. He ran it honorably and strategically. That is not Donald Trump. Donald Trump is not Henry Ford or John Rockefeller or Steve Jobs. He's P.T. Barnum. And I think the media...
Tell us how you really feel.
Yeah, but I mean, I don't even think that's an opinion, though. I think it's in the fact pattern. I think we have to remember that in covering his administration and his history. I think the media was slow, certainly during the Republican primaries, and then even once it was clear Trump was going to be the nominee, to just simply dig back into what was there in books or in the record about his actual track record as a business person. I don't think it's a matter of opinion that he's a better marketer than he is a manager. I think that's just in the documents. It's in public filings. It's in interviews. You can get that anywhere. The only business of size he ever ran was his casino company, and he ran it off the cliff 3 times using other people's money. The Trump Organization itself is a boutique operation. It is not a big Fortune 500 company. He has less than 100 employees. It's essentially a licensing operation now. Banks have not wanted to loan money to him, with the exception of Deutsche Bank. Major banks have not wanted to loan money to him for quite a long time. And he made his, he was in the tundra from about 1991 until The Apprentice in 2004, where he did not have much cash flow. He was unable to get businesses of his own launched, and he essentially licenses his name out to everything from underwear and mattresses to vodka and steaks, as we now all know. The Apprentice gave him the second breath. And it, oddly enough, it created this image of him as the great American entrepreneur who all the toddlers run up to get advice about how to run their own business lives. And in fact, when the show was going on, his casinos were about to go through their 3rd and 4th bankruptcies. So I think that, but I think he's a survivor. He's survived through a lot of personal and professional disappointments. He's benefited along the way from the fact that he had a very wealthy father who gave him handouts along the way when he hit rough moments. But he has survived. But I don't think the Donald Trump who's in the Oval Office right now is any different from the Donald Trump who came running out the front door of his family's house in Jamaica, Queens, in 1946.
You say that he's called you a total whack job, nut job, the sleaziest person he's ever done business with. I think part of why you're on the panel today.
And a psychopath.
And a psychopath. But something that is interesting is that since you were in a lawsuit with him, you had access to a trove of taxes that the rest of us have not. And I know that it is part of litigation, and I don't know what you're allowed to say, but in broad strokes, is the president as wealthy as he claims to be?
No, the president is not remotely as wealthy as he claims to be. I wrote a column about his taxes that I went over with our lawyers before I wrote it about what I could and couldn't say. And I'm precluded from talking about specifics in the tax returns, but I can speak about generalities. And in that column, I said I think the president should release his tax returns. If he were to release his tax returns, I think there's 4 broad themes that would be of interest to people. How robust his businesses actually are, where he derives business income and where they operate, how charitable a giver he actually is, and then most importantly, I think the financial and business pressures that are and will come to bear upon him in the Oval Office that I don't think are very far from the front of his mind. And I think that should be something the press continues to push on. I think we've learned the GOP lacks courage vis-a-vis Trump. I think they've, at least up till now, they've sort of succumbed to seeing him as a force of nature. But I think if the Congress believes in good government, I think this is a nonpartisan, non-ideological issue. They should compel him to release his tax returns, as every president should.
Okay, and our final panelist, my former colleague at ABC News, though he stayed there 20 years longer than I was there, Brian Ross. Through this time and his investigative work, he's picked up just about every award possible, from Emmys to George Polk's to Peabody's. I want to ask, since you're the sort of only person from TV, how different is it covering this president, especially on a medium that he knows something about?
Well, I think we owe a debt of gratitude to Donald Trump, frankly. He has invigorated a often lethargic and sort of access-driven group of journalists who now have really taken up the challenge in ways that are very impressive, as we've seen here with the great work from the Times and the Post and Bloomberg, and I hope some from ABC. And people are hiring investigative reporters. Editors are saying, we want more of this. Our audience, we put a piece on Nightline last week of record ratings at 12:30 at night for a story about Donald Trump that ran 12 minutes. So thank you, Mr. Trump, for waking us up, and we have a challenge in front of us. For television, it can be difficult. We'd like people to come on TV and talk about him. People are afraid of him. People who have done business with him are afraid to talk about him. Women that have had relationships with him either sue him or are bought off by him. So that's difficult. And we have found ways around it, but it can be a challenge to put together not only a story that is broadcast, that with compelling characters, that also fits into the time constraints of the evening and the morning newscasts. We brought along one of them, which we did on Good Morning America, about Mr. Trump and his connections to Russia, if you want to take a look at that.
With his beauty pageants and his buildings, Donald Trump has been promoting himself to Russians for years, traveling to Moscow and other former Soviet states with his children. His daughter Ivanka posted these pictures on social media as she pushed the Trump brand in Azerbaijan.
I'm here in Baku, Azerbaijan.
Yet as a candidate, Trump has sought to minimize any business connections to Russia, as in this interview with George.
Will I sell condos to Russians on occasion? Probably. But I have no relationship to Russia.
But the head of a Russian-American Chamber of Commerce, Sergei Milyan, who says he worked on Trump-licensed projects, told ABC News there were extensive connections.
The level of business amounts to hundreds of millions of dollars that he received as a result of interaction with Russian businessmen.
Hundreds of millions of dollars from Russian businessmen.
Correct.
Trump made millions selling Moscow rights for the Miss Universe pageant to a Russian oligarch close to Vladimir Putin, with a man the FBI considers a top Russian mafia figure invited into the VIP section. The developer of a Trump-licensed hotel project in Toronto is a Russian-born billionaire. And Russian-language promotional videos attracted hundreds of wealthy Russians to buy condos in Trump-licensed projects in Florida, until U.S. sanctions cut off the flow. Now Trump says he's open to lifting those sanctions.
We'll be looking at that. Yeah, we'll be looking. Go ahead.
So he likes Russia because there's money to be made there.
He likes Russia because he likes beautiful Russian ladies, and he likes talking to them, of course, and he likes to be able to make a lot of money with Russians. Yes, correct.
Trump says there will be no conflict in dealing with Russia if he is elected, because his children will run his business in a blind trust.
He's still going to know what the businesses are, where they are.
We will
How
not
could he
discuss
not know
because
that?
we're not going to discuss those things. It doesn't matter. Trust me.
But a leading Republican ethics lawyer says that does not solve the problem.
Well, I don't see how you have a blind trust when you know what's in the blind trust. The appearance is that a foreign government or other foreign organization has influence over the President of the United States.
In addition, what Tim faced with lawsuits and the attacks on the Times and the Post, he also seeks to control the television outlets by controlling his access. It became quite clear to the executive producers of every single network show that when he was on, the ratings went up. And his lawyer, Michael Cohen, would regularly call and threaten, if the Brian Ross story goes on, you're not getting Donald tomorrow morning. ABC went ahead and broadcast all the stories that we prepared, so we were proud of that. But that's one of the ways he tried to control what we would say through access to him. That's an old game in Washington, of course, and I think that Trump, as I said when I first started, by being so provocative and so sort of, I would say mean or taunting the media, a lot of that has gone by the wayside. People are not prepared to risk losing access in order to tell the truth about Donald Trump.
But ironically, David Muir was one of the first people he sat down with at the White House.
That's right. Despite all that we did, the first interview was with David Muir.
Okay, so my first kind of jump ball question is a relatively small three-letter word that newsrooms have been struggling with, not sex, is how to deal with whether or not to call what the president says lies, or call it a lie. In the past 100 days now, we've seen tons and tons of 100 days of Trump's claims. This is from the Washington Post fact checker. It's a fantastic visualization if you haven't been on it. And we've counted 452 false or misleading claims, right? Then you've got BuzzFeed, on the other hand. Here are 100 lies and false statements from Trump's first 100 days. Then you've got our cousins at NPR annotating every single one of his tweets and trying to provide context to what he's talking about and trying to make sense of them, and sometimes the falsehoods that are embedded in them. And then you've got places like the LA Times, which took the editorial board, I think, 6 days on why Trump lies, and they just decided to take a stand on it and lay this case out. So the definition of a lie does include intent. And several newsrooms have said, well, we can't be mind readers. We have to know that somebody intentionally tried to abuse the fact here. But what I'm saying is, I'm asking is after sort of an excruciating fact check, say of the crowd size that I was kind of joking about earlier, that he must have heard about, or the rain that wasn't falling on the inauguration, which a few million people witnessed otherwise to. How and when, what is the threshold to be able to say you're lying, and does that matter in how we present the story? Let's just go down the line. Suzanne, you want to start? Or anybody want to start? Go ahead.
I mean, I can talk to it. At the Post, we have a policy against calling people liars. Our view on it is that intent is difficult to determine, but there's also a slippery slope issue there. When President Obama said you can keep your doctor if you like your doctor, was he trying to sell a plan, or did that just turn out not to be true? It's very hard to know. With Trump, the rush to call Donald Trump a liar, to use the word liar, really is about Donald Trump. But what about other people? Do we call, I'm not sure, I don't know if you've looked this up, but has anybody called a Democrat a liar? You don't see a lot of that. Claire McCaskill said recently she'd never met with the Russian ambassador. Took about 2 minutes to figure out that she had from her own tweets. And there were not a lot of stories that called her a liar. So you get into a tricky situation. And to answer your last question, I'm not sure it does matter. I mean, I think people do know that we had a poll last week, 60-some% of the people who responded said he's dishonest. I'm not sure that calling him a liar or calling it false would make a difference. I don't think it would increase that number or decrease that number.
I mean, as long as people are still assessing the fact pattern. At the end of the day, if you're saying he's a liar, or you're saying he's malleable with the truth, or he spreads falsehoods, or whatever the semantics are around it, so you're not legitimately ascribing intent to it, at the end of the day, he prevaricates on a routine basis almost always. And I do think that's a distinction between him and other politicians. I mean, the Post, Glenn Kessler's done a great job with, and PolitiFact has done a great job with Pinocchios and fact-checking, and that's been a good role of the press, I think, during the Trump phenomenon. He's in a class by himself, however, around this, and I think one of the tricky things we're in now with Trump generally is whether you're covering Trump's financial conflicts of interest, or Trump lying, or how Trump rolls in any of the areas that intersect with him in the Oval Office, is all of us can get sort of scandal fatigue or repetition fatigue with this. And I think the media is going to have to get savvy about which stories it plucks out of that morass to try to convey to voters or readers what matters. And And his honesty matters. It's going to matter if there's a nuclear confrontation with North Korea. It's going to matter when he promulgates new financial regulations. It's going to matter if he tries to gut the EPA. And whether or not we can take him for it at his word, what he says today, and whether he'll deliver on that tomorrow.
I think there's a lot of growing evidence that people don't take him at his word. We saw it in the healthcare debate a couple weeks ago. A congressman from his own party didn't take him at his word. He threatened them and they shrugged it off. And I agree that's going to be a growing problem. He has a very serious credibility issue.
He calls it puffery. We talk about you confront him or his lawyers with misstatements, things that aren't true. It's puffery. And he grows out of a business, as you say, as a great marketer, and that's what marketers do. They puff things up. The Soho condo project is 95% sold out, or maybe it's 45%, but I told him 95 just to help move along the sales. And I think he's accustomed to that and has grown up in that, and it's made him successful, and he continues to puff.
I think there's two things. I think the Times has used that word, and I think it's used it very effectively when, and one of the first times, if not the first time it did, it was on the birther incident, and the Times felt in that instance he was lying, and on page 1 said it was a lie. And I think it was effective because it had been done so sparingly, and it is still done sparingly in the time. But there's a difference between a falsehood, a different story that's presented one day and the other, and a lie. And I think all three should be pointed out. And I think I want to say the other thing that I do in my reporting that I'm careful about, not just with Trump, but with all the people that I covered the governor for several years, and I was also very careful at the time, is when, if Donald Trump says that it's 95% sold out, I don't say it's 95% out, I always attribute it. If Donald Trump said it rained on Thursday, I either check the weather, and I'll say it rained, or I say Donald Trump said it rained on Thursday. You attribute things to them, and I think you get in a situation where sometimes they say something and you present it as fact, when in fact you end up having to run a correction after.
But letting it sit as Donald Trump said it rained when it didn't rain, you know what I mean, without a sort of comma or semicolon, what does that
I think if it didn't rain, then you say that Donald Trump said it rained on Thursday. In fact, it didn't.
Right. Yeah, I think that was
sorry.
I think that was an evolution during the campaign. We're used to, with politicians, everyone spins. And so you're used to sort of quoting them and trying to provide context with Donald Trump. He clearly does more than spin, and as the campaign wore on, you saw everyone, including TV stations, do it in the chyron that, you know, it didn't rain.
We had an unfortunate correction the other day with the governor of New York, where they announced the new secretary to the governor. They announced that she was both the first female and the youngest person ever. Well, it turns out she was not the first female. We had to run a correction, and we attributed the correction to information provided by the governor's office. But we didn't say the governor's office in the first instance provided the information. We ran it as fact.
Right. Trump was testifying in one of these suits brought against him by people who had bought condominiums in Florida thinking it was a Trump project, and when it failed, they blamed him because it was his name. And of course, he was just a marketer taking a percentage by selling his brand. But he was asked under oath in the deposition which we broadcast, do you know a certain man? Felix Sater was one of the businessmen, a Russian organized crime figure. And he said, I wouldn't know him if he walked in this room. And yet Mr. Sater has dealt with him for years, was close to his daughter and his son.
We deposed Trump about Felix Sater, you know, and that was in 2006. So he's known about Felix Sater for at least 11 years.
Well, the Times first broke the story about Sater. He claims they cut off all business with him, and then Sater produced for us a business card provided by the Trump Organization calling him a senior advisor to Donald Trump. So I don't know if that's a lie or puffery, but it's certainly not true that he didn't know.
Would he know him if he walked in a room?
Yeah.
He worked in Trump Tower.
Yeah,
Two floors beneath the Trump Organization.
So what's the readership to think, right? I mean, how do you go about doing your business and quoting somebody who could, even to his own spokespeople, switch the script 5 minutes after he's told Sean Spicer or Kellyanne Conway or whatever the messaging is? He could go the other way, and here we are kind of left holding the bag with text or transcripts from interviews that are completely counter to what might happen 10 minutes from now.
I mean, I think at the end of the day, for his base, I don't think his base cares about most of the issues that the press is consumed with right now. I don't think his base cares about Russia. I don't think his base cares about conflicts of interest. They care about jobs. I think they care about their health care coverage. And I think the rubber will meet the road on the Trump administration when they can't deliver on those things to his voters. I think a lot of the stuff the media covers now is white noise to his supporters. That's not to say it's not important. I think we have to, Russia's a huge issue, obviously, and so are his financial conflicts of interest. But I think whether or not that kind of coverage is going to change his support is a different thing. And that gets back, I think, into kind of, I think, what the media missed during the campaign itself.
You know, I think it's a sad day when we cannot believe the word of the President of the United States, but I think it's also in a perverse way healthy that we are, as journalists, now challenging authority, and I hope it extends beyond just the President, but, you know, not take the word of government just because it's a government official.
The other thing I wanted to ask is a sort of question of trust and how our coverage engenders or kind of diminishes the trust that the audience has in us. There was a recent Gallup poll. I want to say this was the lines at the very bottom on the right side. Those are the lowest levels of trust according to Gallup in the press. Trust in mass media by party. The dark green one is 14%. Those are Republicans. The very light green one are Democrats. And that's 51. So even if you were just looking at Democrats from 2008 on, even in the Obama years, that number's dropped precipitously. And under Republicans, it's dropped massively, even from 2015. You could say that that's the campaign year, right? Then there's a Morning Consult poll that was out just yesterday, day before. Americans trusting Trump's White House more than the national political media to tell the truth. And even in the far left section, if you just want to look at all Americans, again, the red is that they trust the Trump White House more than the national political media, which is the 29% bar on the left. And then finally, there's, I think, a Pew study that said 3/4 of Americans think news organizations keep political leaders in line, but nearly the same portion say news media are biased. So the top bar says 3/4 of Americans think that, that they keep politicians from doing things that shouldn't be done. And then when you look down here, they still think, regardless of whether they're Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal, they think that the press tends to favor one side, that we're in the tank for one way or another. So the system right now in engendering trust doesn't seem to be working, right? So what are the new sort of the Farenthold kind of formulas in covering this president that might get people to actually just believe that we are in the fact business and that these facts do matter? I mean, what else? How do you fix this problem, this puzzle? It's a small question.
I mean, I don't know. I think the country's been politically divided for a long time. It came, it blossomed into full view in perverse ways during this campaign. But there's been certainly attacks on the press since the Nixon administration that have been very full-blooded. There haven't been clear presidential mandates, I think, since the Truman administration. I think all the press can do is stay focused on the facts. Steve can speak to this better than I can vis-a-vis David Farenthold's great work, but David stuck to the fact pattern, and he just looked at what Trump was doing in terms of what he was saying about his charitable giving and what he was actually doing. I think one of the unique things that David also did was he involved his audience in the reporting process through Twitter, famously tracking down that crazy life-size Trump portrait that he bought using foundation money and then stuck, I think, in one of his golf course, on the wall of one of his golf courses. But, I think you should speak to David.
Yeah, sure. I think a big part of what gained trust, what David did, is he invited us all to do it with him. When 2016 started, Dave had 3,500 Twitter followers. He was not a presence on social media in any way. And through the course of his charitable reporting, he brought everybody in. He did what we all could do, and then he sort of reached a dead end, and then he opened it up to everybody else. And then everybody responded. And it was part because it was sort of a caper. Where is Donald Trump's portrait of Donald Trump that Donald Trump bought with Donald Trump's charity? And it turned out to be at Donald Trump's golf club. And
I think a member of that club was following David on Twitter and said, hey, I think I saw that hanging at the club. And he went there and took a picture with his iPhone or something, right?
Yeah, it was actually a journalist at Univision who, their offices are right next to the club. And he went one night, he went late at night and went into the club and found it and reported on it. The other thing Dave did was he made it fun. We should not forget that journalism is fun. And that's a big part of Trump's appeal, and it was a big part of Dave's appeal. It goes a long way to engage people.
The other thing that I think was interesting and courageous about what you guys did, Steve, was in opening it up on Twitter and inviting people in. That's not traditionally how any of us have gone about investigative reporting, particularly if you have something that's a scoop or original. The tendency is keep it inside your own walls, which is understandable. And I think one of the things, the bright spots of the coverage over the last year was media organizations on social sharing one another's work, giving props to one another on social for each other's scoops, and then using social in a way that's different than I think traditional investigative reporting.
I think another part of it is that, this sounds simple, but we have to be better at our jobs. You can imagine if during the course of what Dave was doing we got something wrong, even something small, it would have rebounded in a way that would have made it difficult to go on, or not difficult to go on, but it would just undercut the reporting in as big a way as the reporting was taking on. There's not a journalist in America who doesn't walk into the newsroom every morning and criticize some other story that they think is not exactly right. And so precision is important. We have to do our jobs better. We have to dot our I's and cross our T's in a way that we've never done before because of the spotlight that's on us, and also the figures you saw on the screen.
I think, too, there's a larger thing going on with Trump, and you saw it during the campaign. It was the chaos that he created, and I think that's organization. Chaos is just organization you haven't figured out, and I think we're starting to find our way through that, and I think it's incumbent on reporters not to lose track of the fact that we're going to be going through probably the largest deregulation we've seen in terms of the agencies in this country. There's so many things playing out beneath Donald Trump, and I think it's incumbent on all of us to keep an eye on all these pieces and how it's affecting people, because at the end of the day, I think, and Tim made a point earlier about what his voters care about, it's going to be jobs, and it's going to be a lot of the things that flow from the agencies, and I think it's really keeping an eye on that.
And in that, I think in the context of what Steve and Sue both just said is that, the press remains, unfortunately, somewhat financially illiterate. And one of the challenges that Trump presented in this campaign was that he had a business history. And I think a lot of people who go into journalism grow up as history buffs, and they know separation, of government and checks and balances and but they can't read a balance sheet. And it's a good tool to have in reporting, and I think it becomes daunting for some folks, or they stay away from those stories as reporters because it feels like it's above their head, and I think that held the press back on some Trump reporting in an unfortunate way. One of the things that stays out, there's been a lot of conspiracy theory reporting around Trump and Russia. Some of it's tactile and good, a lot of it is garbage, and one of the quotes that gets repeated all over the place is from Donald Trump Jr. at a real estate conference in 2005, I think it was, saying all of our assets are from Russia. And that has been latched onto repeatedly in various stories that's an indication that he had massive financial inflows from Russia. And when in fact it's actually an indicator that Donald Trump Jr. is as unsophisticated financially as the people covering him. The assets he was referring to weren't assets, they were condo sales. And those aren't assets of the family anymore after they sell them. They're just things they're selling off. It's why Trump Tower isn't actually really owned by Donald Trump anymore. Most of the condos have been sold in that building to other people. And I think I think the press has to be very careful about numeracy and financial sophistication.
So Lowell, I think there's a YouTube series that Tim is volunteering to host on how to read a balance sheet that you guys could host at IRP. Right?
Yeah, that'll put people to sleep.
All right, and also I wanted to ask, how do you determine what to chase and sort of what's a parked car versus, every day there is now a new channel that the president uses actively to craft what he wants on the agenda and what perhaps he wants to see on A1 or what he doesn't like to see on A1. Susanne, you choose not to check Twitter all day long.
No, I don't. It's, I just get busy and I forget, actually. I usually check it sort of at night and on the weekends. I think I'm in a bit of a different boat, and I can talk about sort of a little bit about my decision on what to cover, which is still hard because we're still pulled in different directions. But I have the luxury of being able to look at something and make a longer decision about sort of where I want to be. And I'm covering a lot of the financial Trump organization stuff at the Times and his finances generally. So I tend to gravitate towards that, and there's still just so much to write and to do on that. I find, and I'd like to just hear your take on it, just in terms of somebody who's managing 50 people, because it is difficult, and I see the Times, you know, they're making there's just a lot going on, and what to go to and what not to, and where to focus resources broadly, and you know, where to focus them on the political reporters during the day. It's a tough job.
It's a daily challenge. Well, it's a daily, nightly, weekend, every second challenge. We're lucky at the Post. We're growing, and we have 6 people who cover the White House, and you know the daily tweet sort of falls to them. We have 12 people who are political investigative reporters. So that's one way we do it. We try and strike the balance that way. And I think the press has gotten a little more sophisticated about what to rush to cover and what to kind of roll your eyes at, particularly through the president's Twitter feed. But it's hard. I mean, you ignore one of them sometimes, and that's the one that proves to be important. And so a lot of it's in tone, as well as do you cover it or not? How do you cover it? How breathlessly do you cover it? I think there was a time there when the media as a whole covered it very breathlessly, which is counterproductive, and you just kind of got to figure it out as it goes, because he changes all the time. He changes all the time based on what we do, how we cover it. If we stop to cover the tweets, he'll do something else.
I mean, Stephen, does the coverage of it sometimes, especially in your fact checker team, assigning Pinocchios, et cetera, does it play into his narrative that's been dominant from the campaign and even now, that the fact-checking media, the fake news media is out to get him? He's the only guy telling it like it is.
Sure. I mean, it plays into both narratives. It gives him a target, and it gives us an audience who's interested in the truth. And I should say, we rate Pinocchios from 1 to 4. I don't think we've done anything less than a 4 in a long time. There's moments when I think we ought to do 5, 6, or 7 Pinocchios. But we try and balance it. You know, people check the fact checker. Do we do Democrats and Republicans equally? And there's no way to do it equally now. But what we do with that is we send out tweets and other calls on social media. Send us stuff that's not Donald Trump. What are you interested in? And that's one way we try and combat that. But it does give him a target. It's an inaccurate target, though.
Tim, has the White House press conference decreased in its substantive value while it's actually increased in almost its theatrical value that SNL can summarize for us?
Yeah, that's sort of a metaphor for the whole Trump administration, isn't it? Because I think part of the phenomenon of the Trump administration is we're all standing on a curb looking up at a ledge wondering if the guy's going to jump or not. And there's this sort of just waiting for the car crash to happen. Quality to this that I think is why he's good TV and why people care about this, and I think that all comes to fruition in the Spicer press conferences. I think the media has been overly woe is me sometimes about, they don't treat us with respect, or he came in, Sean Spicer came into the White House presser and was mean to us, and I sort of think, well, who cares? You're not going to get anything of, most of the press conferences are spoon-fed. Most of the great reporting on Trump has been done outside, thus far, has been outside of those press conferences. And I think, Sean Spicer signed on for a tour with the magician, so here he is. He gets to go out there and have to run interference for a prevaricator who is unpredictable and self-absorbed. And so Spicer has a tough road to toe every day in that. But I think because of that, I don't think he can come into those press conferences with a consistent agenda that he can attest to that won't get fact-checked in real time while the press conference is happening on Twitter, which I think is great fun, but I think it also diminishes more substantive approaches to how to cover the Trump administration.
So Brian, if you get a sit down with the president, what's the better strategy? I mean, we've seen our former colleague Jake Tapper famously during the campaign just decide to hammer him on one question for 20 minutes and eventually get an answer, right? And even to some extent, David Muir, when he sat down with him and we started asking him about, you know, the voter fraud over and over again, and what it revealed was that the president is not just confident that it happened, but part of his confidence stems from the fact that he sees that other people say that it happened, right? That's his sort of evidence base versus all the evidence in the world.
I thought David did a great job there, and Jake as well. And I think with him, his attempt to be puffing and huffing and sort of making things up as he goes, I think you just have to call on him until there's, you arm wrestle him to a draw at the very least, or because it doesn't seem he won't acknowledge being wrong, it seems. But I think for the point of view of the viewer, you have to know that he should not be able to get away with that. And I think that's, and when they do the best one-on-ones, the subjects are not broad, but they are deep.
There's been a theme throughout some of the coverage, especially around the term lie or liar, on whether or not this is a symptom of some sort of a mental state of being. Have any of your publications consulted a psychologist or a psychiatrist to try and understand this? And does it even, does that add any value to it, or does that just make you feel like you're so far kind of in one particular camp to try and diagnose him as
Best
crazy?
of my knowledge, we have not. I would not recommend it. I don't think that's for us.
You guys haven't?
Well, I think, covering Trump's state of mind is, it's a rabbit hole. And, he fits every classic definition of somebody who has, narcissistic personality disorder. But, to start to get into putting anybody on the couch, whether it's the president or a neighbor, is tricky because it's some of this is our very subjective assessments, and I think because of the nature of this president and this presidency, we're on safer ground sticking to objective fact-checking than getting into subjective assumptions.
I think the New York Times would encourage Donald Trump to both release his tax returns and his full medical records, which he's yet to do. And I think that may shed some light on it. Especially
given his family history.
What's family history of what?
Well, his father had Alzheimer's. There's been a history of substance abuse in the family. Those are realities. Donald historically has always acknowledged that his eldest brother, Freddie, died of an alcoholic. He said that was one of the reasons he is a teetotaler, which I think he is, because he has enough other vices that he doesn't need to add that one to the bag.
Do tell.
Yeah. And I think it's troubling that he hasn't released his health records.
Really troubling.
I just think every president should be required to release their financial and health records. They make decisions that affect millions of lives and the well-being of the country, and that's just a good government issue. I wonder if in the wake of the Trump presidency, if we'll have Congress firm up legally requirements around disclosure in the presidency.
We're going to open it up to questions. I just wanted to, but before that, so if there are mic runners, kind of find the people that have their hands up. I also wanted to talk, our last question is the chilling effect, the fact that this is a president that's, as Lowell referenced earlier, actively willing to sue publications. You all right now are fortunate to be from places that have legal teams that can defend you, and what about some of the smaller publications that don't have anything close to that? So when you were sort of first faced with that lawsuit, what happened?
Well, as you pointed out, I was very fortunate. I was at the New York Times at the time. I hope David McCraw is still here somewhere. David McCraw is the in-house counsel at the New York Times. He's an ally of journalists everywhere. He's a friend, but I also really respect David professionally. When Trump sued us, he intentionally didn't sue the New York Times, by the way, because he knew that I would get David McCraw for free. But I was also indemnified in my contract with my publisher, which was Warner Books. And so we had an insurance policy on that, and it was a very expensive case. He said, I think to the Post and others, that it cost me a lot of money. I didn't spend a dime on the litigation. And he spent significantly more, by millions of dollars, than we did. But I worry about, I was at a big institution with resources, and Lowell and I were on a panel at the IRE conference in New Orleans last year, and this question came up. Mother Jones was sued within an inch of its life. Sheldon Adelson went after the Las Vegas paper, and those aren't bloggers. Those aren't young freelance journalists.
And they're not the president.
And yeah, and I think we're in an era where I think the press is really, in theory, in danger of being litigated out of existence, possibly, unless there's some sort of a financial resourcing put together to back the press up. At the same time, I think it's good the press should be scared of being sued, because we have to think about the people we write about, and we have to be careful about that. And I think it's a tricky balance.
But aren't Trump's lawsuits a bluff? If he wants to show damages, he has to show income.
It's interesting. He's threatened to sue the New York Times several times in the past year. I think over three stories that I've written, and the most serious threat I felt came on the evening that we published the pages of the tax return. And in that case, it was interesting, because he said he would sue. It was only within his right to publish it. If he had actually gone ahead with the lawsuit, he would have opened himself up to discovery. He never went ahead with it. And I actually think for smaller papers, the threat, it's not to say that these threats are very wearing, especially when you don't have resources behind you. It's easy for us to say we're not worried, but I actually think for all of us, and it was talked about a little bit at the panel last night, is from smaller publications being sued by very wealthy individuals with, almost like we saw different but in the Hulk Hogan case. But I think it does have a chilling effect. I covered other politicians who frequently either threaten to sue or just wear you down, call by call by call. And at a certain point, people, at 10 at night or 11 at night, it gets tiring.
You could take comfort in the fact, though, however, the president doesn't actually understand how libel law is construed or the architecture of it in this country. He thinks it exists primarily at the federal level.
You guys are getting me really excited here, because think if history is a lesson, if Trump's closest, let's say, a regime in our history is closest to Trump in terms of the press, it would be the Nixon administration. From the demonization of the press to the use, not of libel law, but of effect on your publisher, your TV network. He has the government. He has regulators. There are mergers that are pending. There are all kinds of things.
Right, that's a more insidious way of attacking.
Right.
But an actual libel lawsuit? Yeah.
Libel lawsuits, that's just to get your insurer not to reinsure you.
I think it is a bluff when he does that.
But
Because as you say, he'll open himself up to discovery. Let's take a look at your tax
But I think
return.
there's other things that happen, and other things even you start to see into it. I was telling Tim earlier, I was called down for the first time ever to the IRS several weeks ago, months after publishing the tax return story, for identification verification. Was it a coincidence or not? I mean, those are the sort of things.
Well, you are Canadian, right? I mean,
Yeah, you're Canadian.
Yeah, I'm Canadian too, so just to add to
we
the...
trust Canadians.
That could have been the other question. But I think all these things it breeds a paranoia and a worry, whether is it a coincidence, is it not, and the constant calls and the wearing down of reporters. I think that actually has potentially a larger effect. I covered the governor of New York and had a very similar tactic in terms of constant calls and complaints to my bosses, to the publisher.
Right. That does wear you down.
It's tiring.
All right, we had a question right there in the middle. I don't know how he's she'll get to you. Just your name and where you're from too, just so they know.
My name's Barbara Rabb, and I work at the Ford Foundation. And the thing that I guess this question would be for anyone who wants to just comment on it, but one of the things, Margaret Sullivan, I think, wrote about this in her column the other day when she was doing kind of the 100-day assessment, and she talks about kind of the dual thing of scrutinizing and normalizing. And one of the things that I'm kind of just noticing in this panel, I agree that having shrinks put Donald Trump on the couch is probably beyond the scope of what journalists should be doing. But when I hear you talk about these stories about what it was like when we went to interview him, what it was like when he called me 3 times, all of these stories, there's a certain normalization here that I'm hearing that concerns me a little bit. And I'm curious about whether...
Normalization in what way?
Like he's just kind of like this, and so that we have to do our reporting in this way. And I think it is legitimate in the case. I mean, we may be talking about this is a president of the United States. I think it would be worth thinking about not maybe every single story, but when you have experiences like this in the course of trying to get a comment on something that you're working on, and the comment is wrapped in a series of behaviors that are, I think it's fair to say, kind of bizarre from what you're describing, that some of that should actually be part of your
I wrote an
reporting.
entire story on that crazy sequence of calls, because I remember coming out of that, it was in April, and I thought it was so bizarre, and it had got
Yeah,
that I wrote a story for the Times Insider on my weekend talking to Donald Trump.
Yeah, I think
And
there
you know,
should
a
be
lot,
more
a lot
of
of news
that.
organizations now are
people should. I
releasing
agree.
the full transcripts of the interviews. The AP did it 2 weeks ago, and it was great because within that transcript there was like, I think 16 times where in a one-to-one interview in the Oval Office, what he said to the reporters was unintelligible. And they just put it in parentheses in bold, unintelligible. Which, you know, we could probably just hang from the front door of the White House as a little shingle when people go and visit.
Okay, right there, the gentleman in the jacket.
Hi, Mark Hertzgaard with The Nation, the investigative editor. Could I return us to the original panel title here, When the Facts Don't Matter, and Hari's really good question about our believability to the American public, which I want to push the panel a little bit on. If I heard you correctly, you basically said we need to do our work better. Is that really going to make a difference with that roughly 30 to 40% of people who are not paying attention to what happens on ABC or the New York Times, or instantly say, that's the fake news that I'm not going to believe? And could you speak specifically to something that we did a special issue in The Nation about Trump in the media in the Trump era, and the role of Fox News and Fox and Friends, not the show, but the whole right-wing media infrastructure that over the last 20 years has been pushing a point of view that, not coincidentally, basically says that the mainstream media is a bunch of liberals who can't be believed. And I guess my question is it really going to make much difference for us to do our work better, which of course I'm sure we all agree with, in terms of reaching that audience, that part of the American public? They seem to have their minds made up, and they don't even look at us, much less take our reporting seriously, whether it's good, bad, or indifferent.
I would say it's the only tool we have available, to be honest, is to do good work. That's the best we have, and that we hope, you know, Americans we can trust at some point will come to realize. But I don't think we should become advocates. We shouldn't be driven by an agenda. We should just do the kind of work that everyone here has done. You know, it's not I suppose not really satisfying, but I think that's our only tool available.
I think where we could innovate a little bit, I mean, I agree with that, but on social media in particular, there are ways to distribute our good work in ways that we weren't available to us in the past. And that's where we haven't quite figured out how to get into the right streams with what we feel is good journalism. You know, if people aren't going to pay attention to the truth, it's hard, you know, and we have to try and figure out how to reach them.
I think it's a good, I don't know, I wish I knew the answer, but I think one thing that is important, and you got to it a little bit in your question, I almost try to not use the word media anymore and differentiate between publications and Fox and the New York Times and a guy in his basement, you know, has a blog. They all get thrown into this term, the media, and I think differentiation and quality in our discussions, making a distinction. Is the New York Times ever going to reach a core audience that's really hardcore Trump? Maybe not, or maybe, but I just think if we're not all lumped into the same group, it might be a start in terms of them understanding it. Maybe they'll never like it, but I think they're going to understand the difference between the spectrum.
I think it's significant that, you know, after the Obamacare repeal went down in flames that Friday, that the first two calls Donald Trump made were to the Washington Post and the New York Times. He himself is recognizing that establishment legacy publications remain as some sort of gatekeepers around the truth. That doesn't mean that they're the best and the only ones, but even in his, you know, sort of in the reptilian, you know, back of his mind, he's recognizing that that's a real thing, and it remains a real thing. I think that what Steve said about social is the media is really still bad about packaging and participation on social media. I think reporters should get more involved engaging with their readers on social and answering readers' skepticism or questions about facts on social. I think that's another thing we could all do better.
And I think Sue made a really great point. The media is a hugely broad thing. What we tend to do is journalism. And Trump considers Saturday Night Live the media, you know, and if we're all lumped into that category, it's going to be difficult.
You know, when they take polls, how about people hate Congress? They hate Congress, but they love their congressperson. It's same with people who can't stand the media, but they have a choice that they like and they trust. And it's just a battle for the eyes, I guess.
And there's a lot of anti-institutionalism that goes beyond the media. I think, you know, in the wake of the '08 crisis, average Americans felt unsupported by the media, by big business, by political institutions. And both Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump exploited, I think, that anti-institutionalism. And that exists. I think institutions of all stripes haven't lived up to some of their duties to average people. And media is part of a broader phenomenon around that.
Yeah, the lady in red. Oh, okay. Oh, sorry. I'll get to you next. Go ahead, ma'am.
Oh, hi. My name is Rachel Salnav. I'm actually a filmmaker based in Miami. Brian Ross, you started off saying something pretty interesting about sort of this is a great, in essence, this is a very interesting time for journalists and reporters, basically challenging them a bit. And I want to say, you know, living in Miami for the past 6 years, especially what happened recently with the elections with Clinton and Trump, there was a local story out of the local NPR station in Miami about Trump visiting Little Haiti and Clinton then visiting right after. And the moderator mentioned also about sort of the trust in how Americans feel about news reporting and also Trump. And I just want to say that this is a really interesting time because in terms of facts versus, I think, more varied stories, I think it's really important, and I really hope that this time that we're living in now, that there are more varied stories about Haiti, about the Black community, because I come from two communities. I come from Haiti, and I also come from Harlem, the historical Black community that both the Clinton administration are also a part of, Haiti and Harlem. And so I really hope, this is a very interesting panel because it has struck a lot of thought in all of us in terms of reporting more varied stories.
Okay.
So that's...
And let me just, a footnote to that. The Trump campaign identified Haitians in Florida as a subset of population that did not like the Clintons because of suspicion the Clintons, in dealing with the aftermath of the earthquake in Haiti, had stolen money. Close to the election, RT, the Russian operation, flooded the zone with thousands of stories about how Clinton had stolen millions of dollars out of Haiti and steered it right towards that community. Just an idea of one of the stories I think that has yet to have been fully exposed.
I mean, it's not that Florida ever matters. I mean, it's a totally...
Exactly right.
Sir, up there.
Yes, Myron Levin, fair warning. This follows along the lines of a previous question. I think everyone's disturbed to see these survey data that show that the press is distrusted or that it's not trusted as much as the Trump White House. But I wonder, I'd like to ask the panel, I mean, should we take some of this with a grain of salt? What do people mean when they respond to a poll like this about whether they trust the media or not? Do they mean literally that they believe that it's so inaccurate or so biased that they just can't believe anything they read or hear? Some of them probably do. Or do they mean that this is challenging things they believe, which nobody likes, or it is making people or things look bad that they like? I mean, so I wonder if that's where many of those people are coming from, and I just wonder what you think. Because if that's it, then maybe we shouldn't be worrying about it quite as much as we do.
I just hope as reporters we're not deciding how to do stories based on polls from Gallup. That's a mistake, I think, for us.
There was one right here, ma'am, in the jacket. He'll come to you.
Hi, Tim, I think you got at this a little bit.
Sorry, who are you?
Oh, sorry, I'm Jamie Alexis from Common Sense News. You got at this a little bit, but the cultural context for facts with the audience itself. So this distrust in institutions, how do we think about changing the overall way in which we present facts if there is distrust for institutions generally? So thinking about the larger distrust, how do we frame those facts? Like, are we doing them in a way that reaches people in a way that makes sense for them if they are inherently distrustful of institutions? Does that make sense?
I mean, I think all institutions can do is try to be better at what they do. I guess I don't think it's complex because I don't think there's a lot of solutions to it. I think people lose faith in institutions if institutions aren't supportive or responsible or transparent or adhere to facts and reality. And I don't think distrust of the media is a new phenomenon. I think, and there's been a lot of schizophrenia, I think, around people's thoughts about the media. You know, after Trump won, there was this sort of mass response in the United States of, well, why didn't the media get this right? And you let us down. But at the same time, okay, make it right now, media. Go out there and you're the only ones we have kind of thinking. And the reality is there's a lot of institutions in play that Donald Trump doesn't understand. The judiciary, which I think, you know, came into full blossom after his first executive order on immigration. You know, he clearly doesn't understand checks and balances. The media, the business community, the diplomatic and foreign policy community. There's communities that I think just have to stand up for what they've always stood up for institutionally, but make hard choices about who they want to be in this world, because it is a different world. We're in a different time with Trump. He's a potentially very dangerous person who's ill-informed and self-absorbed, and he's an unusual president. He's not the norm. And I think the thing's going to come up. I was thinking when Brian was speaking earlier, you know, it's such an art in Brian's world of, if you're going to aggressively question someone, you can appear to a viewer as being prosecutorial, and yet what you're dealing with is someone who evades questions by responding to most questions in this blaze of word salad. And if you want to really drill down and hold them accountable to one fact, yeah, your viewers can perceive you or see you as very prosecutorial, and that's a tricky, and that you're not being fair. On the other hand, our first duty, I think, is to the facts.
Stephen and I were kind of just kibitzing outside, and it was that sort of juxtaposition of the power of the platform and the Facebook brand, and you had kind of an interesting take on it that works both for and against you.
Can you remind me what my take was?
It was so brilliant. No, he was saying how essentially I was complaining that, you know, the platform's brands have become so powerful that when you ask somebody, where did you hear that, they say your phone or their phone, and then when you follow up, you say, no, really, oh, it was a Facebook story. And then you're saying, actually, Facebook doesn't write stories. There's humans that work at institutions that write stories. Do you remember the publication? No. Do you remember the author? No. Right? So I was telling him of that, and then he said, actually, we haven't done enough to take advantage of that fact now.
Right. That's actually an opportunity for us, right? If the people are going to dismiss us, in my case, the Washington Post, because they don't trust the Washington Post, and then they go on Facebook and they don't know where they read the story, seems like there's an opportunity to put more of our stories there that they might not know where they read it or where it came from. And that's something that we could do a better job of. To answer your question, I think there's one other concrete thing that media organizations can do, which is update our corrections policies. In the old days, you'd have a newspaper and you'd turn to page 2 every day and you'd see what was wrong in yesterday's paper, and it was sort of a ritual that you would go through. Now, information flies around everywhere, and often when something happens, every political journalist in America tweets it, and when it turns out to be wrong, very few of them tweet that. And often the correction gets worse, you know, doesn't get the same play. That all feeds into an idea of our vigor for something that might prove not to be true. It feeds into the idea that we're not checking ourselves. And I think we really need to update how we engage audience that way.
Okay, Joaquin?
Yeah, I'm
tell everybody else.
I'm Joaquin from the Center for Investigative Reporting. I feel dissatisfied with the notion that by just doing more of what we're doing, we're going to somehow subvert this intense polarization that the country feels. I think part of what's feeding it, and this is where I would like some reaction, is we have a great sense of humor about Donald Trump. We've had a lot of great quippy one-liners just in this panel. This is the same approach that some news outlets took to President Obama's tenure in office. And I feel like we're reinforcing this polarization sometimes by, and I understand the humor, there's plenty of it, but I don't know if we really have if we're good at listening to what folks who maybe supported Trump because he was anti-establishment, how they would react to this conversation and our ability to make fun of him while also trying to cover him in a way that is supposed to appeal across that divide.
I would point
my
out
jokes were just while we were waiting for Stephen. It wasn't really meant to be deep.
But I think I would point out the story in the Times this week about the unmet promises that Trump made for people who actually thought he would change things, provide jobs. That kind of reporting, I think, it doesn't satisfy them, but it sort of alerts them that maybe they bought into something that wasn't going to make good.
And I think too, I mean, and we all have different roles up here, and I think Tim also can take a little bit more leverage with, or leeway with his language. He's a columnist. I enjoy it though, but I hear you on that, and I think the New York Times has been deeply committed for a long time, and since the election have sent even more reporters to different regions of the countries, to the border states, and to other regions of the country to follow not just Trump reporters, but things going on in the country. I think there was a recognition that we needed more people out there. We already had a number of people out there. It's a hugely serious issue and no laughing matter at all to the paper.
I was going to say one of the mistakes that I felt was made in the campaign was not the understanding of how Trump voters or voters generally felt about Trump, but how they felt about Clinton. We see Trump as sort of beyond the pale and unique, and I think in a lot of ways he is. But the distrust people had for Hillary Clinton was just as deep. The polls were exactly the same. 63% of the country distrusted both of them. And I think listening to that is something that we need to do a little more of as well.
Well, and there was also, I think you probably saw the Politico story this week, and Nate Silver had gone into this media bubble talking about how there's so much concentration along the coasts, and there are lots of factors that have contributed to that, but there aren't, our panel is filled with people who are more likely than not took the red eye to get here, right? So there's a big middle of the country that wasn't necessarily representative at the table in the first place. And even yesterday, when Fox chose to pull out of the polling collaborative that existed for election night, and maybe it was a pretty smart decision to say, well, you didn't really get that one right, and why are we paying for it, right? Question from here?
First of all, a comment, excuse me, preliminary, Herb Sandler, Sandler Foundation. The best line really about Trump and lying is Ed Koch's line, which is that he wouldn't trust him if his tongue was notarized. The more serious question possibly was raised by the last questioner, which was the concern about those folks who voted for Trump thinking something good was going to happen. I don't know if anybody read Arlie Hochschild's book in which he asks you to climb the empathy wall. And I tried very hard to climb the empathy wall. And at the end of the day, I did understand their problems, and I did understand their anger. On the other hand, they are unbelievably stupid. Because the facts are, who is this man? This is a man who lives for himself his entire life since he was a child, adolescence, young adulthood, failure in business, does not read, has no interest in learning anything, and I believe he's not terribly bright in addition. This is a dangerous human being who threatens the economy of this country and the safety of the world.
So you're still undecided.
Let me tell you what I really think.
But I think there's two issues there. One is Trump's character, and then the other is the issues facing the people that voted for him. And I think those are real. But I see what you're saying.
I think the press, you guys have screwed up on one thing. You talk, for example, about is he lying? You don't understand. You don't understand Trump. It's not a lie. He will say anything that he perceives at that instant of time to be in his best interest.
yeah.
He's a
So
closer.
whether it's a lie or truth, I'm not sure he can distinguish it. How does he change
I don't take him at his word either. So.
position A to position B? Because he doesn't understand the difference between A and B. It's what at that moment helps him. And unless you understand that, you don't understand anything about the man.
Thank you. Down here. Oh, sorry. She's.
Hi, my name's Emily Harge. I work for the Center for Investigative Reporting. Just to kind of piggyback off the conversation we've been having about the polarization of our country right now, in what ways are your organizations addressing the urban and rural divide? So I'm thinking of like the lack of resources and the lack of education that is available to a lot of rural communities that heavily went for Donald Trump in the election. And are you in any way pushing towards hiring freelancers or members of your organizations that have a background in a rural area to bring that perspective to your newsroom?
We have a reporter who's actually been assigned a specific beat as the urban-rural divide. I come from a tiny town of 1,000 people in Southern Virginia. I actually map my entire staff to make sure that we're covered across the country. Our lead Trump reporters from Omaha, Nebraska. We have reporters that go as far west as Alaska. We have a new team at our organization that we call Team America. When times were bad at the Post, we sort of retreated from the country. Times are better now, and so we're going back out. Part of their mission, a big part of their mission, is to address what you're talking about. We've also launched the Talent Network, which is a national network of freelancers that has several hundred, if not 1,000 freelancers in it. And we work to coordinate with people locally all the time. When we were banned from Trump events, we used the Talent Network to go into all of them with freelancers without the Trump campaign knowing about it.
So if you have Team America, that makes you Captain America. Young lady in the front. Is there? Sorry, I think there's a mic that'll get to you.
I think we have a mic up here. All right, I'm going to jump in.
I'm Suki Kim. I'm an author. I'll be speaking at the next panel, the undercover reporting panel. So, the topic that I've covered a lot is North Korea, which, of course, I feel like the media has done an awful job. Not so much the media's fault; they just can't get the access. But when I look at North Korea, that the media's coverage has just created such a horribly wrong perception and made it into a joke and somehow got rid of humanity from it. And I feel like a lot of that has to do with sort of the celebrity profile reporting, where it's really focusing on Kim Jong-un. And I think that with the whole Trump thing, I keep seeing the same thing over and over. Like a lot of articles focus on Trump rather than the issue. And now I'm seeing it again with Ivanka. Like on Twitter, my Twitter feed is just covered with Ivanka coverage. And it's really a celebrity profile tactic, like Kim Kardashian kind of coverage, where suddenly they are celebrity before you even know it. So how do you address that from your networks to, in a way, sort of reposition the way that the topic is covered? Thank you.
I don't know if you've watched the PBS NewsHour. We really don't do much of the celebrity stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think he or Ivanka are covered entirely as celebrities. I mean, there's been a lot of good reporting on Ivanka's financial conflicts of interest. I think it was a little late in coming, but it's there now. I think Jared Kushner is coming out of the microscope in the same way. And look, Trump it's complex with Trump because no one is just one thing. I think he deserves special scrutiny about his bona fides because he's president. He does things that are both humorous, and covering what he does that are humorous or strange isn't at the expense of taking him very seriously because he represents very serious issues publicly. I don't know. I think the Twitter feeds, it might follow different people. I think there's a way to adjust social feeds pretty easily to get less celebrity kinds of perspectives.
Hi, up here. Over here. Ricardo Sandoval with 100 Reporters and the Fund for Investigative Journalism. And, I'm an old guy, and I've been around for a long time, and
I've been called a liar and biased by bankers, politicians, public utility officials. The one that got my attention was when the head of the Juarez cartel said I was a liar to some sources. That really scared the Mexican out of me. And I'll tell you, and I bring this up because there's an old adage I learned when I first learned how to speak English when I was a child, when I came to the U.S., was that was taught to me by the Catholic nuns at the catechism, was that sticks and stones can break my bones, but words would never hurt me. But what are we doing now when the words are actually putting sticks and stones in the hands of the thugs? And I bring this up because I feel like are we taking as seriously the threat, the social threat that's being launched by this administration and by the red baiting that's gone on race, with Muslims, with bad hombres such as myself? And I see that we have a serious full court press now on politics. And are we taking as seriously the potential social threat in this country that's been launched by the rhetoric and by the words
Okay,
and by the lies?
All right, before the answer, I know, Tim, you have to catch a plane at 2 o'clock, and I was told that 1 o'clock is your drop dead, so if you need to leave,
You can do last question or 5 more minutes or something, or you can just keep going as long as you want. I just don't want to be rude. And
No, but why don't you go first in answering that, and then you can duck out if you need to go to the airport.
You know, I guess I keep coming back to the same thing on all of this, but I don't think the press is necessarily going to stop Donald Trump from exercising his authority in the way that he wants to, and I don't think the press is going to stop the partisan divide that exists nationally. I think all we can do is cleave to the fact pattern. I clearly have a point of view about Donald Trump. I think almost all of it is entirely due to the fact pattern. I don't think it's just due to the fact that he sued me. I think I've spent a lot of time with him. I've covered him for a long time, and I think that's all we can do in the face of this. And I think we're going to need institutions to support us in that, so it's not like Mexico. I think Lowell's referenced this story about the number of Mexican journalists who've been killed over the last year in the New York Times today. I think we don't face that in the United States, and it's important. And I think we need institutional support to do our work.
I would say that I think your question brings up one of the frustrations that we probably all share, which is that all of your questions really, there's nothing that's been asked here that we don't work hard on every day. Particularly the people on this panel and a lot of people across the world of journalism, but the impression for the reader is different. What comes through your feed feels like a celebrity feed, or you don't see enough news about Haiti. We wrote about Haiti in 2015 regarding the Clinton Foundation. And so in a lot of ways, the challenge for us is not the work we do, it's the distribution of it. And trying to vary what people read or encourage them to see what we do. There was terrific work done on Trump voters during the campaign last year, and not everybody saw that. They saw a lot of really bad work, or they saw something totally different, but it's there. And so the frustration we have on our end is how do we get it out there so it feels like it's there, so it feels like it's being received in the way that we are trying to do it.
And there's also things like red feed, blue feed that the Wall Street Journal started a while back, which is fantastic. There's also the burst your bubble thing that the Guardian does. The New York Times has a section about people you don't agree with. I can't remember how they phrase it. It's leading thoughts and thinkers and essays from the other side. Right? I mean, these are options that whether you're choosing to click on that on your Facebook feed or your Twitter feed or not, that's up to you. But there are, even these mainstream institutions are trying to figure out ways to expose you to viewpoints that
it's an interesting dilemma, though. I mean, to hear that Ivanka's sort of covered as a celebrity again, is that the media, is that the New York Times? I mean, I know our coverage of Ivanka and Jared has been very centered on their relationship, their proximity to the president, their conflicts. I did a huge piece on Jared Kushner earlier this year and his negotiations with Ann Bang to sell his stake in a building that his company owns. We've done really significant pieces. I just don't know if they're not getting in people's feeds, if the social stuff is more what people see. I also think some of the social stories are the product of a new first family in the White House, and they'll fade. But it's certainly not the predominant amount of stories that I see, but that doesn't mean that that's not an issue. And it's
I
frustrating.
wrote a column, I think, on November 9th about conflicts of interest will be a problem for Trump in his presidency, and someone emailed me and said, why did you write that on November 9th? We need to hear about it earlier. And I referenced one of the first column I wrote about it, which was in May of 2016. And getting to what Steve said, I think it's just there's a lot of coverage out there, and it's hard to rise above the noise sometimes. But I think most of the core issues that people care about have been covered, and a lot of it has been covered in depth.
And I think going back to what Dave Farenthold did and why it was so popular is because of the repetition of it. There were stories he did that didn't run in the newspaper. There were stories he did that never, were on our homepage or whatever. He did so many stories, though, that it showed up for everyone everywhere. And sometimes in journalism, when we do the one definitive story that we feel really good about, if you didn't see it that day, you didn't see it. And that is one innovation that we could work on.
All right. Well, thank you all for your questions. I know this conversation will go on.